Hello everybody. In this video we're going to look at understanding the basics of code build projects in AWS. So let's get to it. So I'm back on the main console screen when you first log in to AWS, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come down to the developer tools down here and I'm going to choose code build. Once I do that, I'm going to get a screen that looks something like this. Now you may already have build projects or not, but that depends on the account that you're using. Now, CodeBuild works with projects, and a project can contain multiple builds. And when I mean multiple builds, I'm more referring to an instance of a build, i.e. a build that's been ran. Right? So a build project can have a history of builds associated with the project. But before I get into what builds actually are themselves, I'm going to create a build project. Now for this build project, I'm going to call it just Angular DevOps Production, because it's the Angular DevOps project for production. Description is optional, so I'm going to leave that out. Now if you look here, I'm going to actually make this screen a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. We've got this concept of a build badge. Now, if you check this, you have to add some markup into your README page on your GitHub or whatever source control you're using to show a badge when the build, and then when the build actually finishes, if it's successful, it'll show like a green badge, otherwise it will show an error badge and so on and so forth. I'm not going to be doing anything like that in this video, so I'm going to leave that unchecked. Going to come down to source. Now, CodeBuild works with a number of different source providers. By default, it chooses Code Commit, which is AWS's version of basically GitHub. So I'm not going to be choosing that. You can also work with S3 as an input, but you've got the input from another code pipeline, which we'll look at a little bit later. GitHub is the one I'm going to choose, but we also have Bitbucket and GitHub Enterprise. I'm going to choose GitHub. Now for repository, I'm going to choose one from my own personal account. So I'm going to select this. Now at the moment, I'm actually connected to GitHub in my AWS console. So I'm going to disconnect for a moment and just show you quickly what that looks like. So if I click this button, and I'm already authenticated with GitHub, so it already knows about AWS. So it's going to quickly jump back. So this is just doing an OAuth identity check on my repository or my account to see what repositories I have access to. So if you're using your account, it should do a OAuth check, ask you if you want to give access to CodeBuild, whatever, blah, 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 blah. You will get that when you click the connect button. Once I've done that, I get a list of all my repositories that I have access to. Now I'm going to choose the Lyrad digital / Angular DevOps project repository, I should say. And so we've set up the repository that we're going to build against. Inside this additional configuration, we have a few other things like clone depth and all this other stuff, build statuses. So you can get a report build status when the build starts and finishes if you want. I'm not going to be doing that here. I am going to check this box for webhook, because I want the build to run every time I make a change to my Git repo. And in here I'm going to put phase 1, because that's the current branch I'm working with. So that's setting up the source, so that's all good. Oops, I wasn't meant to uncheck that. Coming down, we've got this concept of an environment. So CodeBuild works with containers, the Docker containers. Now, you can use one that's built into AWS, which is what I'll be doing. But if I come and click custom image here, we get a number of different environment types that we can choose. So we've either got Linux or Windows containers. If I choose, say, Linux, I can either grab a container from ECR, which is basically AWS's container registry. So you can actually just use a container that you've already registered in AWS. Or we can choose other location, and that can be Docker Hub, like a Docker Hub Docker file or something like that. You actually refer to that image as you would with normal Docker. I'm going to come back up to manage image because I care about just using one of their instances. Now, because I'm building an Angular application, I'm going to be using, well, obviously Ubuntu is the only option for operating system, but for the runtime, I'm going to be picking Node.js, and the version I'll be picking, because I'm using a Angular 6.0 or Angular 6 application, the Node version I'm actually using is Node 10.1, so I'm going to be choosing that. And I will always use the latest image for this specific runtime. So if you don't choose that, you can actually choose like previous versions of 10.1 if you want to. I'm just going to use the latest version. Now this checkbox here is if you want to do stuff with Docker. We're not going to be doing anything there, so I'm just going to ignore that. Coming down to service role. Now, your CodeBuild instance requires certain permissions to other AWS resources in order to run. This role will be set up for you without you having to worry about setting up any of the permissions. So just leave that as is for the moment. We will get back to the permissions on this role later. Coming into additional configuration, there's a whole bunch of other stuff such as setting timeouts. You can specify a certificate if you want to. If you want this to run inside of a VPC, you can specify which VPC you want to use. You can specify the amount of power that you want on this compute. So just say you're going to be running a lot of tests or something like that. You might want more memory or more CPUs, but you've only got 3 options here. The other area you might want to look at is environmental variables, but later on we'll see another way of handling passing variables into your CodeBuild scripts that's a little bit more secure. But you can actually also specify environmental variables if you need to as part of your container, your build. So you've got all that there, that's all okay, but I'm not going to be doing anything in here, so I'm just going to close that. Now this build spec section, what actually happens with CodeBuild is that you need to, in your repository, have a file called a build spec file. Now this can be anywhere inside your repository, but by default, CodeBuild will look for this buildspec.yml file inside of the root of your application. Okay, so I'm going to be just leaving it as is for the moment because I haven't actually added a build spec file to my source, to my repo yet. We'll look at how to do that in the next video. So we're going to ignore that for the moment. We will deal with that once we've built a build spec file. Coming down, we've got artifacts. Now, basically an artifact is kind of like the output of your build. So you can specify where you want the artifact to go. And inside of this expansion bit, we can encrypt it if we want to. And we can also do some caching as well, which I will not look at in this video. Okay, so that's pretty much the basics. If I click Create Build Project, takes a bit. Oh, hang on. I already have a role with that name. Okay, so I'm going to come in and just put a 2 here. So obviously I've executed this build with this type of scenario before. So what have we got here? A policy with that already exists. All right, so that's not going to cover my situation. So I'm going to come up and I'm probably going to rename this to 2 as well, just to get past the policy problem. So what's actually happened is I've ran this before and I haven't deleted the role or policy, and that's why it's complaining, because I already have policies and roles with those names. But now that I've changed the application name and the role name, this should now run. And there we go. So now we have a build project. And as you can see on the screen here, it gives you some basic detail about the build project. And we know it's coming from GitHub. We know the repository is this one here. If there are any artifacts that were a part of it, it would be shown here. It tells you what the build badge status is, which I've got disabled for the moment. Coming down, we've got a build history. I haven't ran any builds yet, so there is no build history. Coming into build details, we can see the name of the build project that we just created. If it had a description, that would be there. Source tells you what the webhook is that we just added to make sure that this will trigger every time we make a git commit and do a push. Then it shows you all the environment details we just had here. Obviously, we can edit each of these areas, section by section. Build spec, it's going to use the buildspec.yml in the source code root directory, which I just mentioned. This file has to exist. We haven't done that yet. We'll get to that in the next video. And then the artifacts themselves, which we don't have any artifacts at this stage. Okay, so that's pretty much it. All this other stuff, such as metrics, we're not really going to be focusing on yet, and build triggers, because they're to do with other parts of AWS that can, i.e., trigger off this build. And metrics is more just analytics around a build. So if you really care about the stuff, you can check it out. Basically, it'll give you an idea of how many builds have ran and maybe the duration of the builds, how many times it's failed, how many times it's succeeded, and so on and so forth. And we can do it on a per date basis. All this stuff is already in CloudWatch as well. So this report information is from CloudWatch essentially, but they've just shown it on this screen. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to end the video here. In the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to create a build spec file, and we're going to talk about all the different phases of a build. So I'll see you in the next video.